Go ahead. All right. I think I see it. We're good? All right. So hello, everybody. Welcome. I am Leland Harper. A lot of you are my students, so you know me. I'm a member of the philosophy department here at Siena Heights University. And this is the second talk in our ethnic and gender studies kind of speaker series for this term. So today I'm happy to welcome Dr. Holly Andersen. She's an associate professor of philosophy at Simon Fraser University, and she's also the graduate chair of the philosophy department. She completed her PhD in philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, and she also holds a Master of Science from the London School of Economics. And her focus, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think her focus is primarily in philosophy of science, dealing with things like causation and consciousness. But today she's going to talk to us a little bit about sports team names and terminology and race and all that fun stuff. So her talk is entitled Sports Team Names and Social Justice, Who Gets a Say? And after this talk, we'll open it up to questions and answers as well. So I'll turn my camera off and turn it over to Dr. Andersen.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm excited to get to give a talk about this because it is really nowhere within the area of the kind of philosophy that I usually work on. So I think it's really important for people who work in philosophy to remember that the stuff that we do has sort of like outside implications and potential for, improving various different parts of the institutions that we're part of. So the talk that I'm going to be giving today sort of comes from the background that I have as somebody who was part of a group of people who were trying to change the sport team name at Simon Fraser University. So I got into this because at the University of Pittsburgh, there's a huge college athletics culture. And so when you're teaching as a graduate student there, you always spend a lot of time with student athletes. And people miss a lot of school because of their student athletics. But at the University of Pittsburgh, at any rate, they were doing what seemed like a pretty good job of making sure that students were still learning the material, even if they had to be gone from class for various different competitions. That then translated to Simon Fraser University, where we have an NCAA, we are Canada's only NCAA school. But at the same time, I discovered when I got here that the sports team name of the Simon Fraser University athletics that they compete under is the Clan, or it was until very recently, the Clan. And it's spelled with a C instead of a K, but it was still really shocking coming from the United States that this was the sports team name that they were competing with right here. And what I discovered is that the school, when I talked to people around the university with the faculty members and administrators, divided very evenly into two groups of people. There were the groups of people who thought this is so clearly and obviously wrong, we need to do something about it, or it shouldn't be like this. And then there was also a group of people who thought, really, is it that bad? That's not what we mean by it. It's spelled with a C, not with a K. Everybody knows that we don't mean that Klan, as in the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. So I was really surprised by the size of this group that didn't think there was anything particularly wrong with it. And I was really kind of troubled by the arguments that they were giving for it. Namely, we don't intend that sort of thing, and that's not what we mean by it. So this has been going on now for about 5 years, at least on my part. And it's been a really interesting trajectory to watch how these arguments have changed. So I'm going to set up the talk by essentially framing it in terms of if you have something that is a sports team name that there's some sort of challenge to, or people saying something like, I really think this is inappropriate, we should change it, then who gets to decide whether or not the sports team name should change? So that's the kind of framing question, and we're going to be looking at some of the different factors that go into it. I think there's some really morally salient features that are particular to the college athletics setting that let us sort of pull out some much broader social justice related issues. So that's what we're going to do. One part of what goes into this kind of discussion, I think, has to do with discussions in philosophy of language. So who gets to decide what a particular word means, and who gets to decide what our intentions are? So there's a way in which words can shift their meaning over time depending on community usage of those words. So words that used to be, for instance, particularly bad swear words might now not register for most people as particularly problematic. Maybe a little bit, a little bit too spicy, but not very much. Whereas other words that used to be just very normally deployed now have a very different kind of tone and implication if they're used in a conversational setting. So there's a way in which the meaning of a word depends on the usage within a particular community. And what ended up coming out in the context of the Simon Fraser discussion is that there was a sort of implicitly self-appointed group of people who were the we when they say that's not what we mean by it. And what the boundaries that were drawn by that we implied is that there was a certain sort of group of people who were largely white and older and overwhelmingly Canadian, who decided that they were the ones to sort of decide whether or not this term was problematic. And it didn't seem problematic to them. And so that's it, we don't mean that. And so all of the, for instance, student athletes who had concerns about it and the other faculty members who had concerns about it, the people against whom we were playing our sports, which were entirely United States teams because we're the only Canadian NCAA school, none of those groups were sort of allowed to have a say in what that word meant. So since the meaning of the word is sort of given by the community of usage, when they were making these claims about what it meant to say, oh, we don't mean that by the word Klan, we mean something else, there's a way in which you're sort of dividing the world up into you don't count and you don't count and you don't count and you don't, like here's the we, and it's this very small, cozy, safe, privileged group of people who get to decide what it is. There's also another argument that went into it that had to do with the intentions. So there is you often encounter this when you're teaching philosophy of language in classes, that, what a word means isn't a thing that I can change just by wanting to mean something different by myself, sort of in my own setting. So for instance, at one point in time, one of my kids decided that the word toast was boring and they were gonna use the word orange instead. And so they'd like an orange for breakfast, or they'd like orange this, or they'd like, jelly on their orange. And you can't just decide that a word has a particular meaning because you intend to use it that way. So there is something about word meaning that makes it an intrinsically social activity, where it is for the purposes of communication, where one person's intentions or one group of people's intentions alone isn't sufficient to settle the word meaning. So there were two different things going on, I think, when there was this insistence that, when we use the word Klan, we're like, we intend something different with the meaning of that than they would intend in the United States if someone said, oh yeah, I'm, a member of the Klan. So part of what the intentions there involve is the idea that, well, I intend to mean something different than it means, except for the fact that in the United States, it has such wide currency that it already has a pre-existing meaning. And there's no amount of, as it were, intentions of a very, very small group of people that can kind of overwhelm all of the other pre-existing usages in the setting where these competitions were taking place. There's also a different notion of intention there, which is the, really I want you to recognize that what we intend is not anything harmful or demeaning or anything like that. We have good intentions when we use this word. And part of part of the idea there is that they didn't want to have moral censure that was in any way associated with the moral censure that ought to be given to white supremacist organizations like the Klan. So they wanted to be sort of clearly set apart as, well, their intentions in using this word are very bad. Our intentions in using this word aren't very bad. But other than the fact that you can't sort of settle the word meaning with your own intention, there's also the fact that intentions aren't enough to settle the question of whether or not there is a group of people who are still harmed by your usage of this word. And that was the part that took a while to get people to recognize here, that you can have really great intentions, okay, fine, but nevertheless do harm to other people. And there's only, good intentions don't get you off the hook for having harmed another group of people. especially in the context where it's being repeatedly pointed out to you. At a certain point in time, so, let's say you're on the bus and you're standing there and somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, you're like standing on this guy's foot. I think you're breaking his toe. He's been trying to tell you for a while. And you're like, oh, but I didn't mean to stand on his toe, sorry. But you leave your foot there on top of his toe. And they're like, no, but you're hurting his toe. You have to get, off his toe. And you're like, well, I don't mean to. I'm not intending to break his toe. At a certain point in time, those intentions become sort of very weak and flimsy. Like, you can't mean that you don't intend to do this harm when it has been repeatedly pointed out that using this phrase is in fact having this sort of harm. So that's part of the context of the word meaning. And it fits into a larger discussion about the usage of different kinds of groups of people versus animals for sports teams' names. So one of the comparisons is with for instance, the Washington Redskins, which were sued and insisted that they wanted to, for a long time, keep their name, despite the fact that it was a known pejorative. And it was chosen specifically because it was a pejorative. So what that signifies is sort of different than what the Klan signifies. And it's different than what might be signified with other usages of groups of people as the sports icons. So for instance, I grew up in Montana, in the Flathead Valley, and there's several different groups of First Nations who are from there. And my high school team was actually called the Flathead Braves, after one of the local groups of First Nations. And somewhere around the mid 2000s, the school actually just sort of decided that, hey, maybe we should look into this. They sort of consulted with several of the local tribal leaders, and then they just decided to change it. Not because it was a pejorative or because it was necessarily harming people, but because they all felt sort of uncomfortable using a term that really was about people in a context where most sports team names are instead about groups of animals. So you have the Bobcats, or you have the Grizzlies, or you have the Eagles or the Hawks. You have all of these, fierce animals that are supposed to, be like the spirit of your sports team, in the sense of like representing your, ferocity on the field of competition. And they just became uncomfortable with the idea that they were using a group of people instead of an animal in a context where most people were using animals for their sports team names. So they switched for that sort of reason. So I think SFU was in a case that was sort of not like the Redskins and also not like this other high school team. They were instead in a place where there was a known pre-existing, deeply established usage of a very deeply problematic sort, such that they were entering into this place where it doesn't matter how much you intend, you can't sort of overcome that kind of historical momentum. All right, so I then want to sort of switch a little bit and talk about college sports in general, because part of what it means for SFU to be the only Canadian NCAA school is that it's competing against a lot of other schools, all of which are in the United States. And college athletics has a really interestingly strange position with respect to the educational system and the professional sports system. And I don't think we have time to sort of unpack everything that's involved in the use of student athletes in the context of making money and generating lots of publicity for schools, while also having college athletics as a path for many people to go from high school to college with a partial or full scholarship in exchange for competing as athletes, and for a lot of students who would like to go to the pros as a stepping stone to professional athletic competition. So I want to sort of frame that by looking at the case actually of George Floyd. So the discussion that SFU had over the summer that really was the one that shifted the discussion about whether or not we should change the sports team name had to do with the Black Lives Matter protests that were going on in the United States in response to the killing of George Floyd. And there was a very recent article in the New York Times about George Floyd in high school and college that really kind of illustrates the sort of dynamic that makes college sports a kind of potentially very unique locus of unjust practices that are embedded in kind of pre-existing social gradients of power that then take on a new form when you put them into the context of the educational setting. So for instance, George Floyd went to a high school in Texas that was known for having really great sports programs. And a lot of the student athletes from the high school went on to play college sports, and many of those went on to play professional sports. However, it was also known as being a very underachieving school educationally. So a lot of students, including George Floyd himself, were sort of given this explicit message by their sports coaches that if you want to, be able to go to college, your path to that is through college athletics. So you need to be really good at the high school level so that you can go to college, because you really weren't getting what you needed in courses at the high school level. And so you're going to have to get there some other way than just through high school educational means. So this was also the case at the University of Pittsburgh, where there were a lot of students who were there were a lot of Black student athletes who were the first in their families to go to the university, and they were able to do so because they were recruited to play for, in particular, the basketball and the football team at the University of Pittsburgh. And so this was for a lot of them a very big deal to be able to go to this well-recognized school and get a very good education, but it comes at the price of then doing student athletics at the same time at a very high level. And what ended up happening to George Floyd happens to people, and it varies wildly depending on the details of the school that they're at. So he went through and he was in fact recruited for college athletics. He almost didn't graduate from high school because his school was performing so poorly that he wasn't able to pass a final statewide exam. But he managed to make it to college, and he played for 4 years there. But at the end of the 4 years, because he'd been spending so much time on athletics, he actually wasn't in a position to graduate yet. But now he's at the end of the 4 years, and he'd been struggling throughout because he was underprepared before he got to college for the courses that he was going to be taking. And then at the end of this, he ended up just not finishing. So he didn't graduate from college, and everyone just sort of shrugged. So his coaches were like, oh, okay, and that's all. And so there's a way in which there was this ongoing sort of promise of, if you're just really good at athletics, then here is your ticket to a different kind of a life from high school to college. And then you got that to college, but then that was supposed to also be a ticket to a different kind of life that just didn't materialize. But in exchange, what he has is something like a lot of accumulated injuries that are going to come back when you're, in your 40s and your knees just really aren't working the way that they should, because of all of the injuries that you accumulated during the path that you were taking to try and get to the sort of educational route to a different kind of a life. So there's this ongoing issue in the United States, especially, where a lot of the student athletes who are recruited are not being given a fair shake in terms of their educational opportunities, because they are pushed to compete so strenuously that there just isn't enough time for them to do both of these two things well. And then at the end of the 4 years of their eligibility for playing, there's usually really nothing. There's no transition. There's no like, here's a 5th year that you've now earned, where you can, finish all of the classes that you couldn't finish when you were competing at the same time. So you just have a lot of students who have a tendency to fall off a cliff. So that's part of the issue when I originally decided, we should do something about this team name, because even if the Canadians were not particularly bothered by this team name, they're playing against a lot of student athletes who might be in just this sort of position. And there's something particularly, insulting and humiliating for expecting some student to pretend that there is no connection to any other clan when you're playing against a student or a school whose team name is the Klan. So this then connects to a further sort of issue on the who gets to decide. So one of the things that's particular about university settings is that there are there are rampant kinds of power gradients, as I'll call them. So there are, university presidents, and there's university administrators, and there's department chairs, and then there's faculty members, and there's grad students, and there's undergraduate students, and there's just this whole array of people who are, in many senses, there just because it is their job to sort of adjudicate the performance of people who are below them in this sort of knowledge hierarchy, as it were. So faculty get evaluated, they get, we get tenure, we get different kinds of salary and performance reviews. You can go up for different sorts of promotion. You have students who are being graded by faculty members. You have graduate students who are grading undergraduate students. So there's very little opportunity to take people who are within this educational system and say that they're at a genuinely equal standing. So there's this idea of testimonial injustice, where some people have more standing or are given more credibility by an audience when they testify to particular sorts of things. So you might think that one person who says, oh my gosh, I was robbed, you think, aha, this person has been robbed. The fact that they testified to it is evidence of the fact that they got robbed. Whereas if somebody, for instance, lacked testimonial injustice and said, oh no, I've been robbed, then this might be reflected in saying, well, let's check and make sure. We need evidence to verify that in fact you've been robbed, which is a way of saying that your testimony itself doesn't count as evidence for the claim that you're making in that testimony. So testimonial injustice is sort of a way of deciding whose testimony to certain, if you're testifying to certain sorts of facts or views, who gets to count as having standing to give genuine evidence, and who's just sort of giving their own opinion and would need to be verified with evidence. So would lack the testimonial standing to sort of give direct evidence. And there's interesting ways in which this hatches out in a university setting, because there is turnover with respect to the undergraduate students who are there for any particular period of time. So undergraduate students who are concerned about the sports team name will be able to show up 1 year and then only be here for maybe 4 or 5 years before they then leave for some other place. Whereas a lot of the coaching staff, including, for instance, like the Faculty and Sport Athletics Association liaison, has been in that role for 20 years. So he's really there over a time where there's a lot of student turnover. And then there's also administrators who've been at the university for 30 or even 40 years and who are there with a kind of stability and long-termness that the students don't have, or people sort of further down in the hierarchy, like assistant coaching staff, also don't have. So this really played out a lot in the context of trying to push for changing the name of the sports team. It turns out people have been sort of saying, hey, this needs to change for something like 20, 30 years, and it hadn't ever really taken. Part of the issue was one that was directly related to testimonial injustice. So when you are an undergraduate student who says, yeah, this is sort of a problematic name, then you don't get taken as credible in the way that somebody who is a dean who says this is really problematic is going to be taken as credible. So there is a standing deficit with respect to this. And that also means that if the dean says, well, it's really not that big of a deal, the dean is in a position to be directly believed about this in a way that the student just tends to not be as directly believed about this. The degree to which one is personally involved in either athletics or in other social justice issues is also a thing that has really directly impacted who gets believed in this sort of thing. So when I first started talking about it, there was a great deal of confusion about why I cared, with this direct implication that I had no standing to care one way or another, that it's just none of my business what the sports team name is. And so who am I to say that? Shouldn't it be somebody else's role? And that's part of what ended up being a big part, or that's part of what ends up being difficult in any sports team changing its name, is that by the very nature of the process of a sports team name, there isn't an established process that is the right one. So you can't go look up the rule book and say, okay, so really whose job is it? You know, you consult with this person, you take it to the Senate, the president approves it. No, there's no actual process that is in place that you can use, because it's such a rare and unique event that nobody actually knows whose job it is. But that really opens a space to say, well, whoever's job it is, it's not yours. So you don't get to have a say on it. And also, you're only here for a couple of years, so you don't get to have a say on it. And also, you're not here for very long, you don't get a say on it. So there was a kind of like, no matter who it was that was saying something critical about it, they didn't have standing to say it for a variety of different reasons. I was, for a long time, not given the credibility because, one, I'm not an athlete. Two, I'm not involved in the athletics program. And three, there was a lot of, but you're in philosophy, why do you care about this? With the implication that I was stepping outside of the appropriate boundaries of my work by caring about it. And even then pointing out that, you know, I work at a school where the team name is of this sort, and that thereby is also my team name. Like, I can't opt out of the team name unless I literally quit my job and leave for some other university, wasn't given standing. So in contrast, I had a colleague that it turns out had been trying for like 20 years, and her name is June Francis. And she had encountered even more resistance, and her resistance was of the sort where they really understood why she cared. So she was one of the only Black faculty members at SFU. She remains one of the only Black faculty members at SFU, but at the time, I think she was one of maybe 2 people. And they thought she was too personally involved. And so she had too much reason to care, but it's the wrong sort. You're insufficiently objective. And so that's also not an opinion that we're going to take into account. And so you can sort of see how this goes. It turns out that anytime there was somebody who was concerned about the team name, there was some other reason why their testimony ought not be taken into account, such that there wasn't any consistent reason for why we weren't taking people's testimony into account. So all of that sort of comes to this, like, you can see how there's these pre-existing dynamics with respect to, in particular, race and gender and socioeconomic background that then sort of come to a head in the context of college athletics. You then have the university setting where there's always going to be a certain kind of hierarchy of power, whereby untenured faculty members are less safe speaking out about it than tenured ones. Student athletes are less safe speaking out about it than college athletics directors. So there's always going to be that kind of difference there. One of the interesting things that also will sort of bring us towards the end of this talk is that at a certain point, they decided to sort of ask the student athletes, well, you know, hey, do you guys really care? And you would think that sort of listening to the students would be a good move if what you want to do is find out, is this really a problem? Well, maybe I'm not in a position to know about it, so I'm going to ask the people who are in a position to know, does this ever cause you problems at away games or at home games? Or just, you know, did it cause you, like, you know, pain in your heart when you signed up for this team? And what happens in that context where you just say, okay, now you talk, is itself a certain kind of silencing of the person that it looks like you're trying to get to talk. Because what you're doing is putting them, who they themselves know to be in a very vulnerable position vis-a-vis all of this power differential, to say something that is likely to be unpopular with people who are at the very top of the power differential. And what I found is that there were a lot of people at the dean level and the college president level who really thought, no, I mean, we're not going to like kick them off the team or anything if they say that they don't like it. But the student athletes don't actually know that. So people who are here on a scholarship are being asked by somebody for whom it is, they're being asked in a context where what this person could or will actually do to potentially penalize them for speaking freely is entirely opaque. So they just don't know what risk they're taking by speaking freely. So this president up here might think they're giving them the opportunity to speak freely, but not in a way that makes them feel safe from any possible repercussions. So then there's a way in which they have to sort of self-silence, because you don't want to risk your scholarship in order to make this point to the president that maybe they're not even going to listen to anyways. And so then you have this kind of unfortunate reinforcing, like, well, I talked to the athletes and they didn't tell me anything was particularly wrong with it. So there's this kind of structural imbalance that's going to be acting such that even if you try and get feedback, if you don't do it in the right kind of fashion, then you are in essence forcing students to kind of not give full testimony. So that brings us kind of to the end of the talk, though, because this ends in a nice way. So I was reminiscing with Leland about 3 or 4 years ago is when they first started pulling down statuary in the south of the United States. So statues of Robert E. Lee were going down, and it was a first real discussion of this sort of stuff that was happening at a national level, to where everybody in very mainstream ways was partaking of it. And there was a petition that we put through, and there was huge amounts of blowback at that time. Then this last summer, there was the Black Lives Matter protests that really took off after George Floyd was killed. And that just did something different, because more people were listening more carefully and sort of recognizing more about these structural factors that would go into preventing student athletes from speaking as freely as they might want to. So the takeaway ended up being this. So the president of SFU at the time, President Petter, was deeply and adamantly opposed to changing the team name. He thought it was like the wrong kind of political correctness gone wrong. And it was very surprising and disappointing, because he was also somebody who legitimately pushed in a lot of other ways for diversity and inclusion to happen at the university. And he really he really said those words a lot, but also translated them into programs that made a great deal of difference for a lot of people here at SFU, including especially First Nation students. So it was very surprising to find that attitude in somebody who otherwise professed to value inclusivity and diversity at the university. So what ended up happening is that enough of the faculty members had said enough of these things for enough years that we were never going to get there just by ourselves, but we did manage to clear a path that the students could see, as a result of which the students could see that there was less danger, like they would have people at the university who would be on their side, and they're not going to just get kicked out of the university or off the sports team by pushing back against this name. And so the protests in the United States gave everybody a chance to talk about it a great deal more, and to listen more openly to what the student experience was when they went to these games. And there had been some process that was in place for we're going to consult everybody who's affected by this and see what they think, where everybody who was affected was taken to include, I spoke to somebody who did fencing in the 1970s, and he's like, hey, I competed under the Klan team name. I am deeply affected by this. And some of us were having a hard time thinking this guy was really deeply affected in the way that our actual student athletes these days who are Black and playing in the United States are affected by this. But what ended up happening is the president got better at listening to other people and actually went and spoke to the students, who put together a very good campaign to push back against it. And then the president himself did a complete 180. He said, okay, we're just calling off that whole part of the process, because no, we don't know whose job it is. And the whole process of trying to consult was a way of inventing a process by which you could change a team name. Like, I guess we asked some people, but he finally just decided, nope, we're just going to call it. This is in fact the right thing to do to support the student athletes. We're just going to shift to a new name. So it ended up working out really well, because it wasn't even a change that happened in the face of great reluctance or resistance. And it wasn't something that he was sort of, I guess if we have to, we do it. He really came entirely around to see how this fit into making SFU a more inclusive place, and a safer place for a lot of the people of color who go to school here and who work here. So that ended really well. And I think there was a nice lesson there for the faculty members to see that we had a job to do to make it easier for the students, in the sense that when I was saying things about this, they're like, well, yeah, but should the student athletes be the one who changed this? You can push back and say, no, actually, they shouldn't have to change this. Like, they could change it if they want to, but you're putting the most vulnerable people in the least safe position to change it. And that's unfair to them. Like, they ought not have to do such heroic things in order to change this team name. The rest of us who are in a safer position, who have tenure, can do this sort of thing instead. So it was a nice kind of dynamic to conclude in that regard. Yeah, that's about it. So are there questions?
Yeah, so if anybody has questions, you can throw them in the Q&A feature down at the bottom of the screen, or the chat feature if that's available for you. And I can field them towards Dr. Andersen. I'll speak for my students anyways, and say, hopefully a lot of the stuff that Dr. Andersen was talking about sounds really familiar to the stuff we're dealing with in our classes this term, right? We've dealt with the color of mind in some of my classes, so a lot of that should sound very familiar. We've dealt with epistemic injustice in all of my classes this term, so hopefully that should sound really familiar. So thank you for the talk, really appreciate it. One thing that stuck out to me is the fact that the university president, he kind of came around after what I imagine is a few years. And, we would, I would assume this is a pretty intelligent, well-educated man who's, an administrator at one of the more, or at least perceived as one of the more liberal universities, at least in the area. And it still took that much to get him to get on board with it. So it's just, it's crazy to see how, how hard some of these things are. And we could think about other people who are far less liberal than that, who are trying to change minds. So if you look at the Washington Redskins, for example, their owner is very conservative and is very reluctant to change, and just everything that's had to go into that. So it's interesting to see that, we like to think that people are smart, educated, liberal. A change like this should be a no-brainer, but it certainly isn't.
Yeah, I agree. I was really surprised at how much resistance there was, and it took me a long time to figure out why the people were resisting. And it was all Canadians, and it was all Canadians. I think it's not accidental that it was all Canadians. So people who mostly have been in North America, in Canada, that word doesn't register like a swear word to them. Whereas if you're from the United States at all, then the word clam just registers like a swear word for you. And so what was happening is people were sort of introspecting their own gut reactions. And then, did you have a Canadian gut reaction or an American gut reaction? And he just clearly had the Canadian one, and he was surrounded by Canadian. When he's like, this is a big deal. No, we don't think it's a big deal. He was surrounded by Canadians. So what's also interesting about the Washington Redskins is that there were some players who really put themselves out there. And seem to have not just convinced the owner to change the team name, but to actually do a bit more like hard thinking about the role of racism in the United States and what his athletes were dealing with. So I don't think he came around quite as much as President Petter did, but he at least started that process. It wasn't just that, okay, fine, we'll change the name. Like, there was a more personal change to it. Oh, there's someone from Montana. Get out.
So we have a couple questions in the Q&A, so I'll just field those first, or bring those to you first. The first one is, what was the full name of the school that had the team name of the Klan? So that's simple. That's Simon Fraser University. And I just wanted to see if you could maybe speak a little bit to the history of the Klan name and where it came from, and where that distinction between Klan with a C is, and the distinction between that and Klan with a K.
Yeah. So I've actually avoided looking too much into why we chose the name in the first place at SFU, because I think it's going to reflect incredibly poorly on the school. And Leland, can I ask you to leave your camera on? I need somebody's face to look at. Okay, so I'm not just staring at a bunch of black. Okay, thank you. It's hard to stay focused when I'm just looking at black faces, or at, like, black screens and boxes. it was right in the middle of the 60s with the civil rights movement. And it was right during a period when Canada was also going through a sort of knee-jerk rejection in many fronts of the idea that it would be anybody other than like essentially white British people who were like the clearly dominant political class in Canada. And a lot of the resistance that I've gotten with like angry emails and stuff in Canada has all come down to the fact that they feel like, why should I be ashamed of my Scottish heritage? You know, why should I have to take accountability for like the history of colonization in Canada? And I think what was going on in the 60s was that, no, this is our place kind of thing. So I don't think it reflects well at all. And I avoided looking into it because I was trying to do a more forward, I think it would have just made people entrench even further. And I was trying to shift the focus to the US. And it felt a little bit bad because I didn't want to let Canada off the hook for this stuff. At the same time as it was more rhetorically effective to say, yeah, okay, Canada, you've got some issues, but at least you're not the US. And that was more rhetorically effective for getting people to decide to change the name. Yeah.
So now we'll go over to the Montana question. It says, I'm from Montana, and do you know what Flathead changed their mascot to? I thought it was still the Braves. Also, what did you think made the people uneasy about the Braves name?
It's really, so I don't know where you're from in Montana, Cody Henderson, but hello. So I'm from Kalispell, and they changed it to the Wolf Pack. Yeah, that was it. And some people still call them the Braves because some people are still very stubborn. And everybody's got like the decal on the back of their pickup already, so you don't take it off. And it's really interesting because Kalispell is a really, really, really conservative place. It is definitely not a place that you would think of as well-educated and liberal. Even within Montana, it's a very, yeah, when I was growing up in high school, they sort of were the first, why don't we start a right-wing militia to overthrow the government place. But nevertheless, they were like, look, there's something weird that we're like using, you know, the local tribes as a way of like talking about our sports teams when we're playing against, you know, the hawks and, you know, the bears and the other sorts of animals. And that was what ultimately made some people feel a little uncomfortable. And it was kind of nice because there wasn't any, they weren't forced to do it. And I think this is part of what I should go into more of these discussions. Like, you don't always do something just because you have to. You're allowed to decide to not be a jerk. So that's the thing, is if you think that you might be being sort of disrespectful or a little bit of a jerk and you want to not be a jerk, then you're allowed to just go ahead and change. You don't have to wait until it's absolutely sure that you're being incredibly disrespectful and rude and genuinely being a jerk, and now you have to change for legal reasons before you change. So that's part of the like, okay, SFU, you don't have to change your sports team name, but you know, you could. Like, you could just be a better competitor by recognizing what you're doing to your, you know, competition and just deciding not to do that. Like, you're allowed to decide not to be a jerk. And that's kind of what happened in the Flathead Valley. So, which was surprising, but kind of, you know, nice.
That's interesting. It sounds kind of like what's happening during question period in our Canadian government right now. There's a lot of stuff that's going on, is why you wait until the last minute to make a change for a lot of things. But so the next question, this is asked twice variously in different ways. Is there any idea what the SFU team name is going to be changed to, or is that still an ongoing process?
So it's an ongoing process, but we should know hopefully by December or January what it's going to be. And they're doing a really thorough consultation process, because one of the other things that it turns out was standing in the way of a name change is a lot of the old donors felt very nostalgic about the old name, but they also give a boatload of money. And it's understandably hard for the president and others to say no to these donors who are then going to pull large amounts of cash away from the university, because they know what programs that cash funds. So they know that it will be actively harming some students if you lose those donors. But also those donors were becoming increasingly alienated by the fact that SFU is just really clearly not a white Canadian school in the way that it used to be. So it is a really, really international school with an incredibly and just like fantastically heterogeneous group of students. And so what they're trying to do now is come up with something that really sort of offers an opportunity for students from lots of different countries and different continents to also feel like this is a team name that sort of connects with them. And that's a very different project than just coming up with something, you know, the Scottish heritage, there's just so few people to whom that appealed in any way anymore, that I think they're trying to come up with something that's a lot more inclusive.
Great. And last question that I see available to me here is, in response to testimonial injustice, what are some ways to make the student athletes feel safe and believe that what they say will be actually listened to by higher faculty? This was a great speech, by the way, and was very eye-opening.
So there's a couple of different things that I think really mattered for some of the students. And what ended up mattering were things that I hadn't thought about in advance. So for instance, I did this petition, and I didn't really think anybody was paying that much attention to it. But then the Peak, the student newspaper here, did like 2 different articles on it, and nothing ever seemed to come of those. But it turns out that somebody had read those and like had in their mind that there was some like weird lady in the philosophy department who like said stuff about this. And then there were some student athletes. There was one of them in particular who wanted to have this sort of be his parting gift to SFU student athletes of the future, that they not have to deal with this team name anymore. And for that student, what ended up mattering is that some other people before his time had read those Peak articles and was like, no, someone else has been talking about this. So it was kind of put out there in the atmosphere as a discussion. And then he could look me up, and then he came to my office and we had a good discussion. And he raised it with his coaches, who it turns out were really supportive. And, you know, we were all in this one meeting that was just weirdly tense. And it was like the 4 main coaches of the male athletics stuff. And this one student was like given the role of being in charge of the meeting. And you could tell he was really nervous about it because he didn't know what to do. And one of his coaches, it was a basketball coach, was like, no, look, like, you know how to do this. And it's essentially just gave him a little like, no, you're in charge and we are here because we want to help you. And sometimes as faculty members, you forget to say that stuff out loud to students. So we all knew that we were on his side and that we just needed him to, like, you know, he could do it and we had faith in him and we wanted to see him do it. But he needed to actually hear that out loud because it was not as clear to him as it was to us. And so sometimes we just forget to say that stuff out loud to people. So that really helped. Another thing that helped is that, you know, once your name gets in the newspaper, then other newspaper people call you a lot. And what had ended up happening is I was having private correspondence with several different students at the time when somebody called me from Global News. And I was like, hey, so I asked the students, is it okay if I pass your information to the media? They said yes. I passed it to the media and they did a great job interviewing them. And then you now have this like sudden uplift of the student perspective. And as soon as you started getting actual anecdotes from student athletes hitting the national media about what they were dealing with at the games, it was like the game completely changed. Because it's very easy to dismiss the philosophy professor because everyone's like, oh, it's political correctness run amok. And what do you know about anything? And you're so stupid, you don't even know it begins with like a C, not a K. But it was really hard to dismiss these student athlete perspectives. Yeah. Anyways, but in the first round, man, I got a ton of hate email. And in the second round, I didn't. And it was kind of really nice because by the time I was able to put those students forward, I already knew that the volume of hate email that they might get as a result had gone way, way, way down. And that was only because we'd been through the first part. And it really made it easier to deal with all of this crap. If you're like, well, yeah, but at least it's me and not this 20-year-old kid who's just trying to go to school and compete and also dealing with this. Like, yeah, it really sucks to read all that stuff, but I have tenure. Like, I do in fact know that even if the president hates me talking about this, he's not going to fire me. Whereas the 20-year-old doesn't know that. So it sucks, but you sort of can put yourself in the line of fire because you are in a more institutionally privileged position than somebody else.
Great. So when you and I first started speaking about this, I think it was right after you got tenure, but you had been on this kind of mission, I guess, for a little bit before that. I'm not sure exactly how long. But did your tone kind of change a little bit after you got tenure? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of feel like I remember you saying something along the lines of, I feel more free to speak about this kind of thing now that I have, achieved that promotion, now that I have that academic freedom and that sense of job security, and how that plays into the kind of, I can't remember what you called it, but the ranking system of power,
Yeah.
basically.
No, and so it was actually in March of 2015, I got my tenure letter, and I was in my office and I was just like, wow, it is official, official, official. Like, man, it takes a long time for those letters to go through, but I got the last one with President Petter's signature, and I was like, okay. And, I read stuff, like the letter itself is very short, but it's, tenure is a certain sort of like great right and privilege. And the letter itself says, that with all of the rights and responsibilities and privileges and obligations therein. And I was like, all right, I have this great privilege. Okay, what should I do with it? Like, what are my actual obligations now that I have tenure? Like, what is a thing that I would like to speak about? And you sort of, so I took a moment, I took like an hour, and I thought through the whole trajectory of my time in academia. Coming from where I did in Montana, it was very improbable that I would end up in this kind of academic position that I did. And so I felt very grateful. That was also the moment when I wrote several thank you letters to professors that I'd had along the way. Because, you forget to tell people stuff out loud. You think they know, and then, yeah. So that's when I wrote up this little like 2-page, here's why we should change the name to something that we can all like actually cheer out loud at a game. And then I signed up for this breakfast with the president that he was doing the next week. So I didn't start it until I got that tenure letter, and it hadn't occurred to me that I should do something about it. But while I was thinking through, I was also thinking about a number of students that I had at the University of Pittsburgh who had really deeply affected me. And several of them were young Black men. One of them was a student athlete who had essentially been the one who told me about the talk that he'd had from his grandmother in Georgia before I went to school at Pittsburgh, who's like, here's what you do if you find that white hood in, like, if it's sticking out of somebody's drawer, like your professor or your assistant coach or, your friend's dad's house or something. And coming from Montana, that was all incredibly new to me. And I realized that, I go back to Pittsburgh periodically. If I ran into this student, I wasn't going to be proud to say, hey, here's the school that I'm working at. I just got tenure. What are you up to these days? If he knew the school that I was at, I was going to feel kind of ashamed about it. So I thought, okay, well, that's no good. You're going to do something. Yeah. So anyways, and then I was very surprised by how adamantly President Petter was against it.
Awesome. Great insight. Thank you for sharing that. Are there any other questions that we have for Dr. Andersen?
Can I make one small note before we wrap it up?
Yeah.
Because there's the part of what goes into making something like this change. It's really awesome because I think there's like an actual objective decrease in the number of racist incidents that will occur in the world because we don't have that name anymore. So like there's a way in which the world got measurably better in some small but non-zero sort of way. And for a lot of us, it came down to like students that we had that were really important. Oh, I hate when I do that, sorry. Anyways, so a lot of students, like it's hard to talk about this stuff in classes, but it really affects people in ways that you don't always understand. So it's worth really having some of those hard discussions, even if you don't think anything's going to come out of it, because this is just one day in a class. Like that is the process by which things get digested and sort of sent out in weird ways.
Yeah, and I think before you've mentioned, I think there was an incident with a football team that you spoke about one time in, I want to say Texas, if my memory serves me correctly. Do you want to maybe speak about that? And that's the kind of incident that then won't be replayed now that this team name is gone?
Yeah, that was, so I got to teach actually philosophy and science fiction class. And it was a freshman seminar, and they had ended up putting a bunch of student athletes into my freshman seminar. So essentially when they showed up, they were like overgrown high schoolers. And it's really fun to teach for like people in their very first year because they show up on that first week and they're just high schoolers. And a month and a half later, man, they're totally college students. And it's fun to watch how fast that goes. And it was so that fall is when somebody had noticed that over the summer I'd done the petition. And so I'd already done the petition to change the school name. We had something like 400 or 500 signatures, and it didn't get public attention until like September or October. So I was in the class itself when suddenly there was like this 4-day period of very intense national attention to this issue. And it was all very mocking and derisive. And that's when I got all the hate email. And man, my students were really concerned about me because they're like, everyone's calling for you to get fired. Like, you're not actually going to get fired, are you? Like, no, don't worry. I sense of perspective about it. And then 4 of my students who were all on the football team and friends with each other were like, oh yeah, we're glad somebody's talking about this because here's what just happened to us at Texas A&M last weekend. And then it wouldn't have, like, they wouldn't have even shared this story except that we were talking in this loose seminar setting with these students about this very issue. And what had happened is there was a bunch of students who were trying to pick a fight with them. There was a bunch of white students who were really angry at SFU students for coming there and making their Black athlete friends deal with this. Like, how can you not know how harmful this is to the students that we play with here in Texas? And like, we're standing up for our friends by picking a fight with you. And they were trying really, really hard to pick a fight with these students who were like, yeah, I you know, but that's okay because we could have taken them in a fight. And I'm like, one, no, you're gonna get your butt kicked by Texas A&M. I'm very sorry. But also, I have a friend who works at Texas A&M, and it is a concealed carry campus. And Texas is a stand your ground state. And I said those out loud, and 3 of these 4 students were Canadian, and they had no idea what I was talking about. And the Canadians, it had never occurred to them that someone would be on a college campus carrying a concealed handgun. And it never occurred to them that someone could pull that gun out in the context of a fight, shoot somebody else, and then have no consequences because they were standing their ground. Even though this was after Trayvon Martin had been killed and Zimmerman had been exonerated for it. And so it was really unnerving for me to realize that my students might have actually been in a context where people were trying to get them to take a swing so that someone could pull out a handgun and shoot them. And that was sufficiently bad that I was on the university senate at the time, and man, President Petter did not want to have anything to do with me at that moment because I was bringing nothing but bad press to SFU. That was a really awkward Senate meeting, actually, the one that was just like 2 days after all of the coverage got started, because most of my colleagues thought it was a terrible idea and that I was a bad person who just didn't know the difference between C and K. But I chased him down after the meeting and I was like, look, you know, you can't, you have to remember, like, you have to look up before you guys go and play in the United States where people are allowed to carry guns and where there's stand your ground laws, because this just happened and you do not want to wait until a student comes home in a body bag before you deal with this team name issue. And he still thought the team name issue was no big deal, but they actually started looking up the laws on the campuses and on the states that they were playing in. So they at least got a little more proactive about it. And when they started realizing how many of the campuses were concealed carry campuses and how many states they play out west and how many states are stand your ground states, I think it started unnerving enough people higher up that it created an atmosphere that made them more ready the next time it came forward as a topic to go, okay, we should listen to the students a little more.
Great. Some of those connections are just mind-boggling, really. So I don't see any more questions. So let's thank Dr. Andersen again for spending some time with us today and sharing her knowledge and her insight. I'll remind everybody, it hasn't really been made too public yet because I haven't made up the flyers. But our next Ethic and Gender Studies speaker will be Pastor Junia Joplin. And her talk will be entitled The Three Graces of Transition. And that's going to be on November 17th at 3 p.m. So that's a Tuesday at 3 p.m. And it will be in the daily announcements, and my students will obviously get the information passed along in class. So that'll be another opportunity for another great talk. So again, let's thank Dr. Andersen, and hope everybody has a good afternoon. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks.